time and time again, it is proven clearly that whenever you have one of the readings from the Old Testament that begins with one difficult word or name, for some reason, they fill all those verses with like 70 of them. They decide that they need to say Nebuchadnezzar, the son of Jehoiakim, who was the son of Fulano de Tal, and so, and all of a sudden it's this tremendous complication, and they decide to name every single person. I think, Moreno, you deserve a round of applause, because that was I have two things to say. First of all, it was awesome. Nobody understood it, but it was awesome. Number two, I'm going to teach you a little trick that I learned in the seminary. I assure you that 99% of the people who are sitting here do not know whether that name is pronounced one way or the other. So no matter how you pronounce it, everybody's going to be like, yes. Got it? So you just move forward. It's all in the look, the perspective. But you were very good. You did get Nebuchadnezzar right, by the way. I want to tell you, this is actually it's a very famous reading. This is the moment when the people of Israel, the Babylonians, had invaded Israel, had attacked Israel, and Nebuchadnezzar the king put all the people, especially those men, the hard workers, the people of the army, all their intellectuals, all these people, he gathered them all together and he exiled them to Babylon. And they were there for a long time. As a matter of fact, the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Jeremiah are prophets of the exile. They're the ones who, when they speak, they're lamenting about the fact that the people are exiled. I personally love hearing this story because it seems to be, to a very large extent, the history of so many people. As a matter of fact, probably everybody who's here has been affected in one way or another by an exile as well. Okay? But the history of Belen is a story of exile. It's the fact that there was a king named Nebuchadnezzar. In our case, his name was Fidel Castro. He came in and he took everything that we had, took all the Jesuits, took all the alumni, took all these people, and he exiled them to distant lands. And they came here to Miami. You know, I hate to beat a dead horse with a stick, but I'm so amazed every time I think about the reality of our school. It's amazing to me. And this, by the way, this just happens, and it's applicable to the Venezuelans, it's applicable to the Colombians, it's applicable to the Nicaraguans. But it's amazing to me how you can have a group of Jesuit priests that were exiled here to Miami, not because they wanted it, but because they were forced to, where they literally had absolutely nothing. And yet, in the process of about 50 years, we're here. It's a miraculous story. I will tell you one really quick one. If you go into the Belen dining hall, not cafeteria, it's a dining hall now. If you go into the Belen dining hall, you will see that beautiful mural, that blue-hued mural, right, with the Belen shield. And if you look at the pictures, there's one picture in there in particular. It's actually two, but I'll talk about one of them. There's one picture in there, which is my favorite one of all of them. And it's not the one of me praying with the football team. It's another one. There's a picture, and you'll notice it, because if you're looking at the shield, it's off to the left, a little bit towards the bottom. There is a picture of 15 men dressed in cassocks. Remember the cassocks that the priests used to wear in the old days, right? We don't wear those anymore. But the cassocks. 15 of these older men, they're sitting down together for a group picture, and every single one of them, without exception, has a grin from ear to ear. Now, you think to yourself, oh, that's probably a picture of the old Jesuits from Belen that they took while they were at Belen at one point. That picture was taken on a ship called La Covadonga. La Covadonga was the ship that Fidel Castro loaded these Jesuits on and sent them away. So they literally went to Belen, they drew them out, they had one of the Belen teachers who happened to also work for the communist government, read the edict where they no longer owned the school and they were taking over the school and that they were all being kicked out. And they led them at gunpoint through the streets of Havana until eventually they got to the port and onto this ship called La Covadonga. They were loaded. And in this room where they were all packed, all 15 of them, they decided to take a group picture all with a smile from ear to ear. And I'm thinking to myself, how horrible. You're losing everything. And how do you get that grin from ear to ear? But in that picture, there's one Jesuit in particular. When you look to the bottom to the left, a little chubbier guy, whose name is Father Juan Manuel Dortaduque. That's his name. And for a very long time, Father Dortaduque was the director of the Alumni Association in Miami. He was given the task of going throughout the world, and that's not a Cuban hyperbole, it was around the world, looking for all the Belen guys who had been sent everywhere, and be in contact with them so that they know that Belen is still alive and kicking. And that whenever they're in Miami, they needed to come together. As a matter of fact, Father Dortaduque, because this was the time before computers and all that stuff, kept all this information on these little index cards, which he filed away. And he would, with these guys, he would call them up and they say, we're starting Belen again in Miami, can you help us? And these Cuban exiles who had no money whatsoever, because that was their condition, in Spain or in France or all over the United States or in Puerto Rico or in the Dominican Republic, they would send Father Dortaduque $5 or $10 or a couple of dollars. And over a period of time, he collected enough money to help build this place where you're standing right now. You know, right now, my job as president is to look for millions of dollars. Dortaduque built this place by collecting $5 bills and $10 bills. But here's a story of Dortaduque that I love, who's one of my favorite Jesuits, by the way. And those of you who knew him would probably attest to the same thing. The story goes that when they were all at gunpoint, and they were collected, and all the Jesuits had to be in this group, and they were held at gunpoint, they were told that they had to leave everything behind. And Dortaduque had his breviary. And if you don't know what the breviary is the book that every priest gets, that he uses every single morning for his daily prayer. It's a collection of prayers. Dortaduque had his breviary and he began to walk out of the school with his breviary under his arm. One of the soldiers, one of the militiamen, grabs Dortaduque and pulls him to the side and he says, you have to leave that behind. And Dortaduque very valiantly said, you have taken everything away from us. This is my prayer book. You're not going to take this from me. These are my prayers. The militiaman stepped back. Dortaduque went back in the line with his breviary, and they began to walk. One of the Jesuits, who was behind him, tapped him on the shoulder, and he says, I'm impressed with your courage to hold on to that breviary. And Dortaduque turned and opened it slightly, and he says, I have $400 stuck in here. He had $400 like separated throughout the pages of the prayer. That's why Dorta's like one of my favorite Jesuits. And I think that the reason why they were all smiling on that ship is because with those $400 they had a great meal. They all ate. Real quick, today's gospel. Jesus says something which is pretty powerful. Jesus was not one to mince words. He liked to say it how it was. He said it like it is. And if you didn't like it, that was too bad. Listen to what Jesus says. Those of you who simply say, Lord, Lord, don't think that you're just automatically gaining, the kingdom of heaven by saying it. The only ones who are able to truly live out the life of a disciple of Jesus Christ is not simply the one that says, Lord, Lord. The one who truly is a disciple of Jesus Christ is the one who knows the will of God and does it. As a matter of fact, and I'll just continue with his analogy, it's his. And I know there's a couple of architects here, and a couple of engineers here, so you understand this better than most. The guy who says, Lord, Lord, but does not do my will is like the man who foolishly builds his house on sand. The rains come like they were today, buffets the house, falls down, because it's shaky ground. But the man who does say, Lord, Lord, but then knows my will and follows my will, says yes to my will, even though he doesn't understand it, even though he doesn't agree with it, even if he doesn't like it. The guy who knows what my will is and does it is like the man who builds his house on solid rock. Doesn't matter the hurricanes, doesn't matter the blizzards, doesn't matter what comes, it will stay firm because it is built on solid ground. What is the solid ground? That you do what the Father asks of you to do. Not simply say it, not simply preach it, not simply pray on occasion. No. Do the will of the Father. What is the will of the Father? What is his will? Perfect. You understand it? You understand the construction analogy perfectly. And it's good that you understand that because we're about to go and build a bridge. We need to know something about construction because as a matter of fact, Carlos Mayol can tell you, just like everybody else who's done this before, that if you build that bridge in a river and the columns that you are building, you build those columns on the sand of the river, all you need are 2 or 3 flooding moments of flood that the bridge will be taken away. No matter how solid the construction is, it needs to be attached to what the Dominicans or everybody else I guess calls la peña, right? The bedrock. You got to keep digging until you get to the bedrock. When you get to the bedrock, start building the column. So Jesus says, you have to do my will. You have to fulfill my will. So what is the will of the Father? What does Jesus want? Tell me then. If this is the analogy, if this is how I am going to make Jesus happy, if this is how I get myself into heaven, what is the will of the Father? Well, you know what it is. Because Jesus has said it 100 times. The will of the Father is this. Ready? It's a 2-part series on Netflix. No, it's 2 parts. Number 1, love God above all things. Number 2, love your neighbor as yourself. I'll repeat it just in case I also didn't hear it. Love God. I meant the Father, by the way, not the Son. Love God above all things. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, you think it's 2 different things, but in reality, they're intimately tied together. Because you can't say, I love God without loving your neighbor. It's impossible. But here's the most amazing part. That love of neighbor is not a love which is expressed simply in words. It's not. Javi, I love you. But if I kick you in the face, it makes no sense. No. Love is expressed more in actions than they are in words. So listen to this. What we're doing tomorrow, taking off to the Dominican Republic to work for 10 days up in the mountains, to build this bridge for a group of individuals who don't have the means to build their own bridge. What we're going to do for 10 days of sleeping on the floor, using latrines, eating the food that's provided for us, sweating under a hot sun, blistering our hands. What we're going to do for 10 days in the Dominican Republic, at the end of the day, is simply that. Loving our neighbor. In other words, fulfilling the will of the Father. That's what you're doing. You are fulfilling the will of the Father. And I've said this in the past, and I'm going to repeat it again. This is not an act of charity. Please take that out of your brain. You are not performing an act of charity for the less fortunate because you are fortunate. No. You are fulfilling an obligation. Nothing more, nothing less. Fulfilling an obligation. The obligation to do the will of the Father. To serve and to love your neighbor. You're going to see a lot of stuff while you're there. And one of the things that's going to impress you very much, at least it always impresses me, is that these individuals who obviously struggle so much and are poor, just like the picture of the 15 Jesuits, they have smiles from ear to ear. And I think that the reason why they have that is because to a very large extent, their lives require them to depend so much on the Lord. They've got it very clear. So they do away with those things because they can't afford it, that are just too much. We are going there to fulfill the will of the Father, as Jesus says in today's gospel. Amen? Amen. And the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So why don't we stand?